It's my pleasure to welcome you to Klangraum Krem. So I'm very sorry. The novels by Paavo Matsin and Baret Magarian could not be more bizarre and visionary. Do we need drastic forms of comedy in order to still be able to create social panoramas of our present reality? I would like to introduce you to Rosie Goldsmith. She's a multimedia British journalist and international moderator. She has worked for BBC Radio Worldwide and now directs the European Literature Network in London. Please, Rosie, come to the stage.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the European Literature Days. And the wonderful thing about being here for me is that it is so European. Just on this stage alone, we have so many different nationalities, so many different languages. I'm going to introduce each of them with their languages, I think. This is Maximilian Murman, and Max is going to translate from Estonian from Paavo Matsin. Paavo speaks English and Estonian and various other languages, but we're going to stick to Estonian and English. But Max is German. So that's good. It's not but Max is German, but and Max is German. So we've got that. You speak other languages as well? How many languages do you speak?
Well, I translate from Finnish and Estonian.
Finnish, Estonian, German, English. That's enough. Enough. And Paavo, you speak Estonian, English, Finnish?
And Russian.
Finnish and Russian. See, that's, how many? That's about 8. Baret.
I speak rudimentary Armenian and pretty good Italian.
And English. Now, Baret Magarian is in fact of Armenian descent. Both your parents were Armenian.
That's right.
But you were born in Britain.
Yes.
And I can add a few languages. German, French, and Italian for me, and English. And we all come from so many different places. It's a really fantastic European mix. And the other thing I hope you will all notice, and we didn't plan this, but we realized that this event is not just called Satirical Prophecies. I think it should be called Sartorial Prophecies, because look at the way they're dressed. It's amazing. This morning, you know, there was so much color. And I thought, finally, I'm at home. I've met fellow color lovers. But we are here, of course, to enjoy literature, to enjoy these incredible novels from these two men. But and they do, as Walter Gron said, they do have an awful lot in common. And what we're going to do is to allow you to get to know the novelists and their novels a little bit and have some readings. And then we're going to have a nice big discussion with everybody together. And Max will translate for Paavo, but not for us, unless we get into real hot water. We don't understand each other. Great. Well, look, Paavo Matsin. Paavo lives in Tartu, and in fact, Paavo has just been made Tartu's city writer in residence. And I think that is quite a wonderful thing, because it's also very fitting for our event, because I read the Laudatio, which was wonderful, where they said that the choice of Paavo as Tartu's city writer was because they felt there needs to be some bohemian humor in the position, which Paavo Matsin reflects in his works and action. And Paavo himself said that he wants to provide readers with a sense of catharsis. I think it's much better to laugh about fear, even if you're staring death in the face, to turn dystopia into comedy and a parody of itself. Now, Paavo is not just a novelist. He's written 4 novels, but he's a poet, literary critic. You've been a teacher as well. You've done all kinds of things in your life. And I think you're particularly well known for being very experimental with your writing. And we'll hear a little bit of that. Now, the book that we're going to be talking about today is called Gogol's Disko, and it's won several prizes. It's what I think people call your breakthrough novel. In other words, it broke through into many different languages, and it is quite wonderful. And I want to also briefly introduce Baret, and then we'll go and talk about the novels a little bit more. Now, Baret, you've also published four books?
4 books.
4 books, yeah. And the Fabrications is the book that we're going to be talking about today. Unfortunately, we haven't, you've got the English,
Yes.
You've got the English version. I've read the books, but as PDFs. I don't actually have the books with me. I like to have the books on the table, and you've got Gogol's Disko in...
Yeah, there is the German.
In German, yes. So you know, by the way, there is a bookstall at the back of the room here, and it would be really fantastic if you bought these books, because authors do like it when you buy their books, very much indeed. Now, Baret has also had, like Paavo, I think, very interesting background, very many different pursuits in life. You've written music, you've done lots of journalism, you've experimented a lot with literature, all forms of literature and writing. Is that sort of fair enough description?
Absolutely.
How to encapsulate a life in a very short time, it's very, very difficult. And the Fabrications, which has won so many wonderful plaudits, is a big, bold, this is a New Statesman, which is an English news magazine, cultural magazine. The Fabrications is big, it's bold, it's entertaining, it's Faustian, which I thought was a nice European quote here. It captures the absurdity of contemporary culture and society. Well, they both do that very well. So, welcome to both of you, and let's hear a little bit about the novels, each novel. So, Gogol's Disko, which I think, okay, we'll give a little synopsis first. Shall I do that? Yeah?
Absolutely.
Okay. Unless you'd like to practice your Estonian. No? Okay, well, I'll do that bit. But then we do want to hear you talk. Now, the thing about Gogol's Disko, it is, in fact, the reading will tell you probably more about it than the synopsis, but it's a multi-layered, multi-level action with lots and lots of characters. It plays with time and history and all kinds of situations. Now, it's set in a kind of future. It's set in a small town in southern Estonia in the future. And this town has been occupied, invaded by not just Russia, but Tsarist Russia. And so what would you call the date? You know, where would you set the date? I know it's a vague future.
See on paarikümne aasta pärast võib-olla.
So around 10, 20 years in the future.
Aga see on selline retromaailm, kuhu jõutakse.
Yeah, but it's a retro novel in an old-fashioned way.
It's very old-fashioned, but it is set a little bit in the future.
Yeah.
But the extraordinary thing is you wrote this book quite a few years ago, and it was translated, I think, in 2019 into English,
Yeah.
which is when I read it. And but what has happened now with Ukraine and the invasion again, and the fact that the Baltics are always frightened that the same thing will happen again with Russia invading the Baltics. I mean, it couldn't have been more prescient, more of a prophecy in a way. Was this your fear that it would happen again? Or is this just a fear that you live with all the time in Estonia?
Kui ma seda kirjutasin, siis ikkagi oli veel nagu rahulik, on ju.
So when I wrote the novel, it was still peaceful.
Aga selles romaanis on ka
Paavo, you can speak normally because you've got the microphone, and then Max can translate.
selles romaanis on ka üks selline prohvetlik asi.
So there's one prophecy in the novel.
Et seal pannakse monument välismärkideta sõdurile.
So there is the story about a monument for the unknown soldier, which was put up.
Ja tegelikult paari aasta pärast, kui ma selle kirjutasin, siis tegelikult ka sellised monumente venelased juba panid, on ju.
So some years after I wrote the novel, in fact, there was such a monument put up by the Russians.
Nii et noh, et kui ma seda nagu lugesin ajalehest, siis mul küll nagu võttis nagu külmaks natuke.
Yeah, so that was really, in a way, a shock when I read this in the newspapers.
So you're shocked by your own writing?
Yes, that I'm like Nostradamus.
Nostradamus, exactly, yes. Beware of what you predict. Yes, well, let's not go any further with that, because it must be very frightening for Estonia at the moment and for all the Baltic states.
Me oleme harjunud sellega.
Yeah, but we got used to it.
Me oleme hirmueksperdid.
We are experts in fear.
So let's hear the beginning of this novel. I mean, there are so many characters in this novel, and it is very difficult to provide a synopsis, but it is full of these extraordinary characters who live in this town called Viljandi. Is that correct, the correct pronunciation? Which is a real place. And
Yes.
that's where you live, is
Yes,
it? As well as Tartu? Yeah.
Very small but real.
And it's interesting because you tackle a whole city of London in yours, but you keep it small. And it starts at the beginning, and the beginning of the novel has this wonderful character who's a pickpocket, and he meets Gogol, and we'll let you take it from there, I think. So we have the translations, it'll be screened above you, and Max is going to read it now.
I'm going to read the German version, and it's actually not the very first chapter, but the second chapter. So there is this one protagonist, Opjatovic, which has already been introduced in the first chapter, and now we meet Opjatovic again. Der Fremde. Die Straßenbahn kam mit einem fürchterlichen Poltern und Klirren an, wie ein Bandit, der nach einer durchzechten Nacht ein Tambourin um den Hals hängen hatte. Zu seiner Überraschung fiel dem Taschendieb auf, dass der Waggon gar nicht leer war. Bei der mittleren Tür saß eine männliche Person, gehüllt in einen zerfransten bräunlichen Schal. Auf dem Kopf trug der seltsame Stiljager eine mit Karakulpelz besetzte Schirmmütze, die aussah wie eine altmodische Ziehharmonika oder ein riesiges Schneckenhaus aus Stoff. Obwohl die Straßenbahn gerade ihre erste Runde drehte, war der gesamte Boden rund um den Platz schon entsetzlich voll Sand, sodass Opjatovic beim Passieren des Kuriosums einen flinken Rumba-Schritt machen musste, um seine Schuhe zu schonen. Solche Spinner waren nicht seine Spezialität, denn ihre Unberechenbarkeit konnte nur Probleme verursachen. Doch es war offensichtlich, dass dieses Gespenst an der Haltestelle zuvor am neuen orthodoxen Friedhof zugestiegen war, und deshalb beschloss Opjatovic als Profi, es zu riskieren. Schließlich war niemand auf der Welt zerstreuter und nachlässiger als jene, die mit Verstorbenen und Beisetzungen zu tun hatten. Hinterbliebene und Trauernde ließen sich von allen an der Nase herumführen, vom Bestatter und dem Totengräber bis hin zum alten, vor Eau de Cologne triefenden Tubaspieler, der wieder und wieder sein Honorar einforderte. Und diese armen Tröpfe zahlen natürlich. Sie heulen und zahlen. Ganz zu schweigen von den zynischen Gastronomen und all den anderen, die sich berufsmäßig um die Trauergäste scharten. Das war ein hartes Geschäft. Bei diesen gottlosen Schakalen blieb für einen ehrwürdigen Dieb nichts mehr zu holen. Aber versuchen musste man es. Opjatovic setzte sich hinter den Mann und bemerkte sofort den modrig-süßen Geruch, eine seltsame Mischung aus Weihrauch und den Intimproblemen eines alten Menschen. Während er mit dem Brechreiz rang, ließ er seine Hand mehr aus Neugier als aus Profitgier in die Manteltasche des Fremden gleiten. Oho, die Tasche war innen mit teurem Bärenfell ausgekleidet, aber voller Sand. Er zog die Hand erschrocken zurück, da ihm aufgefallen war, wie der Unbekannte etwas vor sich hinstammelte. Der Dieb konnte 2 Sätze verstehen, dass etwas zu früh geschehen war und dass jemand gewarnt worden war. Der verrückte Kerl sprach mehrmals von Malaria. Dann aber begann der Spinner immer stärker zu zittern, mit dem unerwarteten Ergebnis, dass sein rindsledernes Portemonnaie neben dem Sitz zu Boden fiel, prall wie ein Pottwal. Opjatovic begann spontan die Melodie von Murka zu pfeifen.
Thank you very much. So, Paavo, why did you want to reincarnate Nikolai Gogol?
Kui mina olin väike ja ma elasin nagu siis Nõukogude Liidus nii-öelda Eestis on ju. Ja siis ei olnud ühtegi ju õudusfilme Nõukogude Liidus.
So when I was younger and when I was living in the Soviet Union, there was not one single horror movie.
Aga oli ainult üks ja see oli Nikolai Gogoli väga väikene teos, V.
But there was one, and it was Nikolai Gogol's V, or it was based on this.
Kus üks üliõpilane läheb suvepuhkusele, aga ta ei jõua koju, vaid jõuab ühte külla, kus üks mees palub, et ta teeks tema tütrele surnupalvet.
And there is one student, and he is on summer holiday, and he wants to go home, but he doesn't reach his home. Instead, he comes into a village, and there is a man, and the man asks the student to stay there for his dead daughter and keep a death watch.
Ja muidugi see tüdruk ärkab öösel üles ja on nõid ja kirstud lendavad ja midagi hirmsamat ma nagu polnud näinud, kui see üks film, mis oli venelaste tehtud nagu.
And of course, this young woman awakens to life and becomes a witch, and coffins are flying through the air, and I haven't seen anything as horrible in my entire life.
Ja kui ma nüüd vaatasin 2 aastat tagasi, see oli täpselt sama hirmus.
And when I watched the movie 2 years ago, it was exactly the same fear I had.
Nii et mõnes mõttes ma tulin tagasi oma lapsepõlve hirmude juurde.
So in a way, I came back to the fears of my own childhood.
Ja kirjutasingi Gogoli V põhjal oma Gogoli Disko.
So, and on the basis of Gogol's V, I wrote my own book, Gogol's Disko.
It's, as I say, it is very difficult to sum up this book because there is so many characters in it, but there is a bookshop, and there is a bookshop owner. There are some very brilliant set scenes. There's also a lot of surreal satire. There's the occult, there's alchemy, and there's some really laugh-out-loud moments too. And there's this after Gogol has been reincarnated in a tram, which was, just the reading, he is then fed chicken Kiev. And this brings in, and then he gets diarrhea. So he's, some really, really funny, horrible moments. And then a lot of the characters spend a lot of time on the toilet. Now, I need to ask you about the toilet, okay?
Ma tegelikult ei osanud selle Gogoliga seal midagi peale hakata.
So I didn't know what to do with Gogol, as a matter of fact.
Et ma panin ta lihtsalt nagu WC-sse kinni.
So I simply put him to the toilet.
Sest ta ei olegi seal põhitegelane, põhitegelased on ikka need, kes seal nagu kes seal ümber on.
So he's actually not one of the main protagonists. The main protagonists are the people around him.
True. No, but you reinvented Gogol, so you had to bring him back. But is that a metaphor then for putting Russian literature in the toilet? Is that what you did?
Jah, aga raamatust ka võib lugeda eesti kirjandust ainult WC-s tulevikus.
Yeah, but in fact, Estonian literature can also only be read on the toilet in the future of this book.
See kuulub dystoopia juurde, see on dystoopia juurde.
So this is also part of this dystopia.
It's absolutely brilliant. We'll talk more about that after we've heard from Baret Magarian and about his novel. But the fact that you have recreated Gogol as a kind of, not messiah, but as a kind of god for these people in this small town, because they do treat him like a god. And I think there is, I just want to read one little quote which I took from the novel. Something unprecedented. This is Noel Hard, the bookseller, talking about Gogol's appearance. You know, he's so impressed that Gogol has come to their little town. He says, a great author, an intellectual giant who has studied, read, and is respected by all, has risen from the dead, and like Lazarus, has trampled down death by death. I mean, it's absolutely brilliant. And then you say that, just think, he says right at the beginning, we have Gogol here, Gogol. Well, it's a good thing we're not dealing with Pushkin. So on that note, let's talk about your Messiah, because that is an incredibly strong aspect of your book, Baret. Now, we're talking about this book. I don't know whether this is this one, but you've got that. You've got the fabrications.
That's the German edition.
That's the German edition. That's great, as against by all the books. Now, Baret, this book was your first novel, 2017?
Well, technically, actually, it was my second.
But it was the first that was...
First that was published.
First that was published.
Yeah.
And it's a long novel. It has probably everything and everyone in it. And it's a bit like yours. It's just teeming with characters. There's so many ideas, and there's the whole surreal humor idea and, you know, upturning reality. But it is primarily, it is a novel about contemporary media and celebrities and how far that has gone. Yeah. So give us a synopsis of your novel before we hear from you.
Okay, well, I'll try and make it brief, but it's essentially the novel centers around the protagonist, Oscar Babel, who's at the beginning of the book, we see him working as a projectionist in an old-style cinema in London. Which
it's contemporary times.
Yeah.
It's not the future.
No, it's kind of contemporary, but it's also kind of ambiguous about the actual time setting.
Brexit is not mentioned.
No, thank God.
Boris Johnson is not mentioned, but they're there, sort of.
Yes, so Oscar's this projectionist. He's kind of invisible, doing this invisible job, and he has a friend who is a novelist who wants to start writing. Having written popular fiction for a long time, he wants to try his hand at serious literature. So in order to make that change and to also inspire Oscar to change his life, the novelist Daniel writes a story about Oscar that's a reinvention of Oscar's life in fiction. And slowly the details from this story that Daniel has invented, these details begin to manifest in reality. And in the process, Oscar gradually starts to move away from complete invisibility into spectacular fame and visibility, primarily because of the kind of machinations of a spin doctor who appears later in the story. And at the same time, Daniel, the writer's life kind of goes down the tubes, and he becomes depressed, and eventually he becomes even anorexic. So it's about this transference of energy between Oscar and Daniel. And when the doctor, the spin doctor, comes in, at that point the novel really addresses head-on the ideas that you mentioned about the media and celebrity and the manufacturing of fame, the manufacturing of identity and opinion and truth, ultimately.
It's an incredibly strong idea, but also an absolutely brilliant read, because it is also, in the broader sense, a comic novel, in the same way that covers it.
Yeah, I think that. I'd say it's a serious comic novel.
Yes, well, they're both very serious. Don't worry, they are very serious. But it is in the best tradition that they make serious points very often with a comic technique.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was trying to in a sense, I was trying to sugar the pill a bit. You know, when you give a child medicine, you have to give them some ice cream or honey, or as a reward for their endurance of tasting the bitter pill. So I was kind of saying to the reader, I'm going to tell you something that's maybe a bit painful or uncomfortable, but I'll hopefully make you laugh. As George Bernard Shaw, I think it was, who said, if you're going to tell people the truth, you better make them laugh or they'll kill you. And I really found that to be very resonant.
I think that's a really good quote, actually. I must remember that one. But your protagonist, in the same way that Paavo has so many different characters in this, but there are about 5 protagonists, I suppose. But the main one is Oscar, as you say.
Yeah.
And I love the descriptions of this, dare I say, failed writer, Daniel Block, at the beginning. He says, I'm 48, over the hill, divorced, childless, and regarded by the literary establishment as a joke. True, I've sold books in droves and never courted the critics, but after a while, one longs to be read by people other than secretaries and accountants. So he's a really popular novelist, but he doesn't like being a popular novelist. And then you have this unremarkable Oscar, who is truly a bland, lazy character. And this man is transformed into the new Messiah.
Yeah.
I mean, where did you get that idea from?
Well, I don't think it's that particularly kind of audacious or original. It's really an idea that exists in many forms and mythological kind of configurations. So it's basically a trope, and creative writing professors, and of which I'm one, I might add, would probably identify that basic kind of movement from obscurity to light, from anonymity to fame, as an arc, as a standard storytelling trajectory in a way. And there's this you see this in all stories to some extent, I think, this kind of movement. And I was just kind of amplifying it and adding my own take on it. But it's really, I was really interested in this notion of taking somebody who's literally invisible and putting them under a spotlight, putting them in front of a camera, putting them on a stage with an audience and listeners and attention, etc. And that contrast between anonymity and visibility was a strong thing that I felt I could develop. And I think it's always interesting when you take a character out of his or her own comfort zone, or in a novelistic setting, and put them in an unfamiliar place. And usually when that happens, some drama or tension is born, and hopefully the story possesses some energy as well. And plus, the idea of this anonymity voyage to visibility, I think it's very, very much in keeping with the emergence of politicians today, who one day you've never heard of them. I mean, I'd never heard of Liz Truss, and suddenly she was Prime Minister. Then, thankfully, she was gone, fairly short-lived Prime Minister, which was a graceful ending to a disastrous
It was a
premiership.
Disgraceful ending.
Yes.
It wasn't even
graceful in the sense that she was no longer with us. Yeah. But that kind of movement from anonymity to fame, it seems to happen all the time now in the public arena. And so I just felt, yeah, this is actually quite relevant.
Oh, it's very much like, reading Paavo's novel now. It's already, 5 years later, taken on a completely different significance, because of what's happening now. And it's the same with yours, I think. Before we hear your reading, because your reading focuses on Ryan Rees, and it's a little bit further on in the novel near the end. Now, Ryan Rees, terrible name, deliberately, I'm sure. They're all great names, by the way. He's a publicist. He's a publicist to the stars. And he is so bored with promoting celebrities that he wants to take somebody, a complete nothing, and make something out of them, and that is Oscar Babel. And when Rees meets Oscar for the first time, he says to him, "You have what it takes to be the scourge of society." And then Oscar says, "But I always wanted to be a painter." Well, says Rees, "You would have been one by now if that was your destiny. It's obvious you have certain, shall we say, political talents, and I'm here to push them to set you up." And then he goes on, "Oscar, you can become a philosopher, a thinker who's entertaining. Forget actors and writers and the rest. You'll be a one-off. There are 1,000 writers, 1,000 performers." Anyway, you both write about writers too, and I want to talk about that after we've heard the reading. But let's hear your reading about this dreadful Ryan Rees.
Yeah, and
what happens.
Perhaps I should just quickly give some context. So Rees is about to meet Oscar in Oscar's hotel room, which Oscar's now living in a very fancy hotel.
So the Messiah has risen.
Yes, and just when this extract begins, Rees has come into the hotel room, to tell Oscar that his latest appearance on stage has been a great success. The media's going nuts about it. It's been a wonderful, media festival of, hype and celebration, blah blah blah. And Oscar now says to Rees he doesn't want to go on being this fake Messiah. So this is the confrontation between the two that takes place. "Rees, I'm quitting, I'm stopping. I've had enough," said Oscar. Rees clenched his fist and stared hard at it. Then he unclenched it, dumped the newspapers on a table and pulled out a cigar. He bit the end off and lit up. Then he took a seat and smoked quietly for a few minutes. Oscar paced about, waiting for an outburst which didn't come. "Care for a cigar, Oscar?" "Okay." The formalities proceeded apace. Oscar took the cigar and then a seat opposite Rees, grateful of the buffer of a small table between them. They smoked in silence. "Oscar, what did you mean just now? Did I hear you correctly?" "Please don't get upset. The thing is, I have to stop. None of what I've been saying is original. It's all coming from another source. I'm not a philosopher. I'm not a guru. There's just a void here." He stuck an index finger to his chest. "And I've been pretending. We all know I've never been to India. We all know I know nothing about Sanskrit. All I've ever done is a bit of projecting and life modeling. The public have a right not to be made fools of." "Oscar, don't you think I know you're a fraud? That's what the hell we've been doing, you and I. Creating a fake, a bit of forgery. Except in this case, the exhibit's a man. I'll offer the press a simple statement and tell them I'm retiring. But you've only just begun." "That's true, but I can't carry on like that." Rees puffed on the cigar thoughtfully, then gestured logically with it, going on. "Oscar, may I ask, do you have something against me personally?" "No." "Do you see me as a cold representative of the real world, a man who does commerce with the world and fits in?" "No." "Do you resent me, have contempt for me?" "No, not exactly." "Are you unhappy with the life I've given to you? Are you unhappy with power, influence? Are you dissatisfied with the penthouse suite in Chelsea? Would you prefer your bedsit in Elephant and Castle? Do these gold taps and this triple bed fill you with distaste?" "No." "Well, in a way." Suddenly, with extraordinary violence, Rees lurched forward and stubbed his cigar out on the palm of his hand. Oscar wailed in pain, while Rees bawled viciously, "You fuck! If you quit now, I'll ruin you. I'll see to it you don't get a job as a lavatory attendant." "You pathetic little shit. Is this the thanks I get for pulling you out of obscurity?" I've spent thousands of pounds on this enterprise and I mean to recoup my losses. Not only that, but I mean to make money and continue making money out of you. Yes, Oscar, yesterday produced a gold mine, but I can't be doing with your eccentricities. I haven't fucked about concocting lies, telling stories, wooing editors and writers to see you bow out. I haven't put you up in a hotel and then glimpsed success to see you quit. Oh, I see. It's unethical. Oscar, that's what's troubling you. Look around you, shitface. There are no ethics or truth anymore. Grow up a little. There is no reality anymore. Reality is what you choose to make up, what you choose to manufacture, or what I, Ryan Rees, choose to manufacture, to be exact. Get used to it. It's too late to cry now. You should have said something at the time. Did you think I was doing all this for you out of the charity of my heart? Did you think I was trying to be a philanthropist? Did you think I was some kind of cretin?
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Amazing. And there's more of that, so do read the novel. It's, as you very vehemently said, it's a very serious novel as well. You really do hate all this, the fabrications, don't you, of life?
Well, no, I don't hate it. I mean, I think that anyone who's engaged in a serious literary endeavor, as I like to think I am, cannot help but be struck by the falsifications of the media, the exaggerations, the propaganda machines, and so on. And you know, you just as an observer who's sensitive to some extent or wants the best for society, one can't help but be troubled by the degradation of culture that I think now is going on, and by the degradation of awareness that I would argue social media and similar factors have basically accelerated. I'd like to think that my writing in some way could, in some humble way, would serve the function of making people perceive reality and see the importance of trying to honor truth and trying to promulgate a real debate, discourse, real intellectual values, facts over hearsay, sensitivity over expediency, integrity over profit, and so on. And that's what I think all writers to some extent are engaged in, this intellectual kind of purification to some extent. I mean, not that writers should be preachers or...
I was going to say, do you think writers in that sense are prophets in the way that you build up these...
I think if a writer thinks of himself or herself as a prophet, I think that's a bit of a waste of time, and it's pretentious and it's a bit arrogant. It may well be that their work could have a prophetic component, but I don't think a writer should sit down and say, right, now I'm going to write about the future, and I'm going to prophesy, and I'm going to be this fortune teller or whatever. I think that's misguided, and inevitably that would lead to failure. I think the prophetic dimensions of writing come about because the writing's good, not because the writer sets out to write something prescient and prophetic.
Let me bring Paavo in here. When you hear that about the writer as prophet, because when Gogol is reincarnated, they hope that he will become this new prophet. And by the end of the novel, you have a new set of gospels of the prophet of Gogol. They're called the Gogol Gospels. So this idea, which you both share really, which you satirize, the idea of the writer as a prophet. Can you talk to us a little bit about that aspect of your novel?
Ma arvan, et inimesed nagu vajavad prohveteid tegelikult, on ju.
So I think that people are really looking for prophets.
Et näiteks nagu Jeesus, Voland, Meistris ja Margaritas, on ju.
For instance, like Jesus or Voland in Master and Margarita.
Ja mulle tuleb meelde üks Gogoli näidend Revident, on ju.
And one of Gogol's dramas comes to my mind the government inspector.
Kus terve linn ootab kedagi ja siis nad peavad ühte valet inimest siis revidendiks ja ümardavad teda ja tema on nende jumal tegelikult nagu on ja naerab nende üle.
So there is one person coming to a small town and they are awaiting him and they take him to be the government inspector, but in fact he's the wrong person, but they pray to him and they treat him like a god.
Et see on nagu kirjanduses on loomulikult see nagu täitsa läbiv või arhetüüpne teema on ju, just need prohvetlikud kujud on ju.
So these prophetical figures are some archetype of literature, of course.
Ja samamoodi on ka kirjanikke peetakse ka ju prohvetiteks tegelikult on ju.
And of course writers are also taken to be prophets.
Aga kirjanik on ikkagi täitsa lihtne inimene tegelikult.
But in fact writers are easy or normal people, simple people.
Kui Puškinile tuli Lütseumisse külla üks suur kirjanik.
So when Pushkin, for instance, came to the Lyceum, he was taken to be a grand person.
Üks väga suur kirjanik. Ja kirjanik tuli uksest sisse, Puškin oli valves.
So a writer came and Pushkin was there waiting.
Ja Puškin oli oodanud teda ja mõelnud, kui suur kirjanik tuleb.
And Pushkin didn't wait and was surprised what a big writer is coming.
Aga selle suure kirjaniku esimene küsimus oli, sõber, kus on tualett, on ju?
But the writer's first question was, friend, where is the toilet?
Yes.
et selles mõttes kõik on nagu lihtsam alati.
So in fact everything is a bit simpler.
In fact, toilets feature in both your books. But anyway, let's not talk anymore about toilets. But let's talk about writers, because you both are obviously great fans of Mikhail Bulgakov. In fact, you quote the Master and Margarita right at the beginning of your novel. There's a wonderful quote. Tell me about those writers who have influenced you, because there's obviously an absurdist, are they absurdist writers mainly for you? Paavo, first of all.
Minu üks lemmikkirjanik on küll Bulgakov, et ma võin öelda küll, jah.
Yeah, one of my favorite writers is certainly Bulgakov.
And why?
Sest ta kirjutab segaselt, aga hästi.
Because he writes chaotic in a good way.
Nagu Mestis ja Margaritas, keegi ei saa aru, mis seal tegelikult toimub.
So, for instance, if you take Master and Margarita, you really don't have a clue what's actually happening.
Aga see on väga ilus.
But it's very beautiful.
Väga prohvetlik.
Very prophetical in a way.
Aga mulle meeldib üks saksa kirjanik, Gustav Meyring.
But I really like a German writer, Gustav Meyring.
Kelle peateos on Koolema.
And his main work is
100 aastat tagasi kirjutatud.
Which was written some 100 years ago.
Ja kus ta võtab ühe vana juudi müüdi, aga teeb sellest hästi moodsaks nagu.
So he takes one Jewish myth and makes a very modern version out of it.
Et võtab selle Golem, mis oli savist mees, on ju.
So he takes this figure of the Golem, the man made of clay.
Aga teeb sellest oma raamatus psüühilise nähtuse nagu.
But he makes the Golem into a psychological phenomenon.
Ja tal on ka see, et ühelt poolt on hästi hirmus, aga teiselt poolt on hästi nagu satiiriline või paroodiline.
So in one way it's very dreadful, but on the other hand it's also very funny and satirical.
Täpselt samamoodi nagu ka Gogoli revidendist, mis me rääksime.
So just like Gogol's government inspector. Et
inimesed kardavad seda revidenti, aga see vale revident naerab nende üle tegelikult.
So in one sense they fear the government inspector, but on the other hand the government inspector laughs about them.
See on kõige hirmsam, see olukord ongi kõige hirmsam.
So this situation is actually the most dreadful.
Kui hirm ja naer on nagu koos.
When laughter and fear come together.
You mentioned previously when we were talking, you mentioned another writer, Hasek, as well. And I wonder whether you just talk a little bit about him, because this is, we don't read enough in English. I don't know whether Baret has read Hasek and Meyring and Bulgakov. I know you have, but have you read them as well?
I have some,
yeah.
Yes.
You see, this is again, what I would call the European tradition. I don't think we read enough of them in English. I don't know whether you agree with that. But tell us a little bit more about Jaroslav Hašek and why you're inspired by him.
No, esimesest maailmasõjast on kirjutatud minu arvates kõige parem romaan just nagu huumori võtmes ja see on Hašeki Šveik, on ju.
So in my opinion, the novel about the First World War, or during the First World War, which was written the best and the most humorous was Hašek's Šveik.
The good soldier Šveik in English.
Yes. Et noh, ma saan aru, et traumaatilistest kogemustest võib kirjutada väga traagilisi teoseid, on ju.
So as I understand it, you can write very dramatical about traumatic experiences.
Aga tema valis nagu selle teise tee, et nagu idioot, selline naerev idioot on keset sõda, on ju.
But he chose a totally different way and chooses this figure of the idiot to approach this.
Aga samas idioot on kõige targem, on ju.
But in fact, the idiot is the smartest of everyone.
Ja noh, Eestis on ka väga palju raamatuid kirjutatud näiteks deportation küüditamisest, on ju.
So in Estonia there are also a lot of books about the deportation.
Nagu umbes 200,000 eestlast küüditati venelaste poolt, on ju.
Yeah, so a lot of Estonian people were deported to Russia.
Aga ja noh, inimestel on see hirm nagu ikkagi nagu olemas, on ju. Me näeme Ukrainas ka tegelikult ju toimusid küüditamised praegu, on ju.
So there is this fear, and of course in Ukraine we see that these kinds of deportations are happening.
Aga ma mõtlen nii, et nende noh, traagiliste raamatute kõrval tuleb kirjutada ka mingisugune selline, ütleme siis, paroodia, on ju.
But I think one can also write some sort of parody about these tragical experiences. Nagu keerata nagu see, vajutada see groteski pedaal nagu põhja. Okay, so push this pedal of the grotesque as much as you can.
Mm.
Et see on nagu minu tee.
And this is my way.
Brilliant. And Baret, I want to ask you the same question about writers who've influenced you. And maybe before you answer that, I'd like to just point out to people how much art there is. You're obviously a great art lover. And I wonder whether artists, also painters and so on, have inspired you, and musicians, as much as writers.
Well, it's interesting you ask about musicians, actually, because
you're a musician, aren't you?
I am.
Yes.
I'm only an amateur musician, though. But I was just thinking, actually, about the influences on the novel. And one of the most important influences was actually Gustav Mahler, which sounds a bit odd because he's not a writer. But what I mean by that is that Mahler's music is sort of, in a sense, structured around these extreme contrasts, which utilize, on the one hand, street music, parody, popular tunes, folkloric harmonies, and so on, and on the other hand, very lofty, kind of almost metaphysical passages, which are very beautiful and spiritual and hymn-like. And there's this constant interplay and interaction between the sort of the grotesque and the sublime. And that kind of thing is very present in the fabrications, I think. So I was trying to constantly move from the pathetic to the beautiful, the elegiac to the funny. And so that was, Mahler's music was actually very important in that respect. But regarding writers, there's a very great American and unjustly neglected, I would say, writer called William Gaddis, who is hardly even now, hardly anyone really knows his name.
Do you know his name, Howard? No.
Well, anyway, Gaddis was a great sort of influence on the book, and Gaddis wrote this book in the mid-50s in America. 1955 it was published, and the title, in a sense, my title, is kind of almost a reference to his novel, which is called The Recognitions. And it's a novel that is incredibly complex and rich and long and dense. And there's a kind of ambition in that book which I really kind of admired and in a way, was trying to kind of, in a way, emulate. And I've always liked novels that try to basically say everything and do everything, and try and put the whole world into the parameters of that text. And I was trying to do something like that. I was going for that kind of novel, which is the total novel, you know.
It's very 19th century idea as well.
Well, it is, but it's also contemporary. I mean, there are writers like David Foster Wallace, Roberto Bolaño, Murakami, who are trying to do the same thing, I would say, much more successfully than I am. But I mean, you know, if you look at their magnum opuses, David Foster Wallace, Infinite Jest, Bolaño, 2666, Murakami, you know, The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, they're all pretty much novels about everything. There's everything in it. There's love, there's philosophy, there's humor, there's tragedy, etc. And I was trying to do that. I was trying to basically add, you know, put everything in, including the kitchen sink, you know.
And the toilets.
And the toilets, and the showers, and the broken ovens, and the organ grinders, and whatever was at hand, and hopefully it makes some kind of unity.
I mean, Paavo does the same with his novels. Everything is thrown in. But I'm wondering whether you agree, though, that there is a return to that kind of novel. Because if you look at the recent novels written by I'm thinking of English novels at the moment, William Boyd, Jonathan Coe, Ian McEwan, just to name a few. They have written everything novels, the everything novel, you know, where they've thrown in whole lives. Do you think that is happening again, Paavo, where, you know, we put everything into a novel, and a novel is much more ambitious?
jah, et mina ei ole ka kunagi kirjutanud nagu žanriteoseid, on ju.
Yeah, for instance, I have never written any genre literature.
Ja ega näiteks on täitsa võimatu öelda, mis žanrist on Meister ja Margarita nagu, on ju.
For instance, it's impossible to say which genre Master and Margarita was written in.
Et ma kasutan mingisuguseid, ütleme näiteks sürrealismi kui nagu töövõtet, on ju, või tööriista, on ju.
So, for instance, I use tools from surrealism.
Aga ma ei kirjuta sürrealistlikku teost, on ju.
But I don't write surrealistic novels.
Aga minu raamatuid on olnud väga raske paigutada näiteks ulmesõpradel või nendel fantastikul.
And my novels were very hard to categorize, for instance, for fans of fantasy literature.
Et kuskile tikudoosi on neid väga raske panna.
So it's very difficult to put it into a small category.
Et minu vaates kirjand peab olema nagu täitsa vaba, kui sa kirjutad.
So I like when as a writer I have total freedom to write.
Ja ma tahaks, et ilmuks rohkem kriminaalromaane, kus mõrvariks osutub kummitus.
And I would like very much to read crime novels where actually the murderer is, for instance, a ghost.
Write
Why
it.
not?
Write it.
Why not?
Why not? Exactly.
But all the crimi writers hate me in Estonia.
They will hate you.
Absolutely.
But yes, okay. Well, you brought up the word surrealism, and you know part of the title of this event is about reinventing reality, and you do that in a very particular way. Explain your interest in alchemy and the occult, because that has been from the beginning, since you started publishing and writing.
Et mul on hästi tore istuda kirikus, sellepärast, et ma olen nagu lõpetanud preestrina ülikooli.
I really like to sit here in a church because I went to a school for priests.
University.
A university for priests.
Ja et selles mõttes...
Did you become a priest?
Jah. Aga ma viimasel kursusel sain aru, et minust ikka ei tule nagu preestrit.
But in the final course I realized that I'm never going to be a priest.
Kui ma juba teenisin koos peapiiskopiga altaris.
Yeah, when I had to deal with the bishop at the altar.
Ja siis ma pidin nagu tegema mingi lõputöö ja ma valisin selleks alkeemia. Et minu lõputöö on Carl Gustav Jungi alkeemia.
And so for the final text I had to write at university, I chose alchemy, and I wrote about Carl Gustav Jung's alchemy.
Et ma nagu olen ka lugenud ülikoolis alkeemiakursust näiteks.
So, for instance, during university, I also took part in alchemy courses.
Ja keemikud nagu raputasid pead, nad tulid kuulama niimoodi.
And they just shook their heads there.
Keemikud.
The chemics.
So I would call you an alchemist and an absurdist, a surrealist, if you like, even though you say you're not writing surreal novels. But I wonder what we should call you, Baret, what label we should give you. I mean, philosopher is pretty good, isn't it?
Am I a philosopher?
Yeah, I'm wondering, how, because as you say, you have a very strong sense of the parable. I mean, you're writing very moralistic stories, novels, and your short stories as well have a real sense of morality in them, good and evil.
Yeah, I suppose so. I don't, as I said earlier, I don't think I want to be explicitly prophetic or moralistic or didactic. I mean, I hope that the writing's strong enough and anything that comes out of it that's, ethical or philosophical or deeper is sort of a byproduct of the main narrative drive, and the story is compelling, and I've always felt that's the element that should be the most important element.
So what?
And that the characters are interesting, and that one can feel empathy for the characters and so on. I think when the engine of the car, when the engine is fueled by narrative and story and character, then the car can move forward. The thing can move. The story can actually have motion. And if there's anything else, that's great. That's a bonus. That's a bonus. If there's a moral or a philosophical dimension, that's something.
You mentioned comedy before, and that you felt that in a way you were sugarcoating. You wanted to sugarcoat the hard realities, and I just wonder if we can talk about the role of comedy and humour and satire in both your novels now, in your work as a whole. I mean, what role then does the comic play for you? It's not just manufactured in order to sugarcoat hard reality, is it?
No.
That's too bland.
No.
A description.
I mean, I think it's it's a bit like if you're depressed and confronting the painful kind of truths of life, of which we are now excessively aware. You're on the desert island, let's say, of depression, but the comedian or the comic can offer the guy on the desert island a raft or a boat or a passageway out, or even the individual in question, if he's or she is a very good swimmer, they can swim to the next to civilization, let's say. So we're stuck on this desert island, but comedy and humor is a way of processing grief and actually accessing salvation. So I see comedy very much like in those terms, and that's why I think manic depressives are very funny, because and you mentioned this
last night. In fact, we were
your
talking
dialogue with the psychologist, the lady,
the philosopher of
yeah, and I think that's why depressives are often very funny, because they're depressed and they need to get out of their depression, so they find salvation through humor. And so humor, I think, is very important and functional, and it can help a society or an individual to, as I say, process grief. I mean, not immediately. I mean, you need time to process grief. You need, distance and detachment and perspective as well. But I see, for me personally, I've always used humor as an anesthetic in a way, but also as a way of transcending my own pain. And it's such a human tool. I mean, it's actually free. With wine you've got to pay, So humor is actually free. So that's how I look at it. And I would love to think that one of my books or stories might serve that cathartic function rather than a moralistic one. I mean, I know what you mean, that the stories have a moral thing, but I kind of slightly feel uncomfortable. I don't want to judge anyone or be, obviously moralistic. But I really would like anyone, perhaps who's feeling down or melancholic or bereft, if they were to read one of my things and feel lighter or perhaps happier, that's the most beautiful gift anyone could give a writer, I think.
I feel we should applaud that. That's just amazing. It's wonderful.
Thank you.
Paavo, how do you feel about comedy in that same way? Because your books they're very funny.
Yeah.
And I love that about them too. You can just have a straightforward laugh as well as, the tragedy part of it as well.
Et ma ei kirjuta nagu dystoopiat, et Gogoli Disko ka ei ole düstoopia, vaid ta on düstoopia paroodia. Et see on hästi oluline.
I don't write a dystopia, for instance. Gogol's Disko is not a dystopia, but it's the parody of a dystopia, and this is very essential.
Ja ta on ka kogu kirjanduse paroodia nagu.
So actually it's a parody of literature in its totality.
Sest kriitikud mõnikord ütlevad, et mu raamatutes inimestel on kogu aeg mingid seiklused, nagu toimuvad mingid seiklused, millele ei ole põhjendust.
So critics often say that in my books there are a lot of things happening, a lot of adventures, but they don't have any basis.
Aga ma kirjutangi nagu, aga inimesed tahavad seda lugeda, ma kirjutangi nagu seiklustest, on ju.
But I want to write about these adventures, these happenings, and that's what people want to read.
Aga need ongi, ma kirjutan nagu paroodia nende kohta, sisuliselt on ma viin nagu groteskini.
Yeah, but I write a parody about them, so essentially it's a parody.
Ja tihtipeale mul on niimoodi, et on väga palju tegelasi, ma ei oska nendega midagi peale hakata ühel hetkel nagu.
So there are often a lot of protagonists in the book, and I don't know what to do with them.
Siis ma lihtsalt panen nad kuskile kinni.
And so I just put them somewhere, lock them away.
It all works.
Et minu poolt tehtav kirjandus on nagu kirjanduse paroodia.
So my point status in literature is the parody of literature.
So let me ask you to round this up a little bit. What do you both enjoy reading? I mean, do you read or watch comedies on television or films? Do you read other comic writers?
Ma ei loe väga palju, jah.
Yeah, I read a lot.
Et ma õppisin kunagi filoloogiaks ja seal oli see kohustuslikult kirjandust oli nii palju, et ma rohkem väga ei.
Yeah, so I studied philology, so I read a lot, I had to read a lot.
Aga ma loen niisuguseid veidraid autoreid, nagu see Austria kirjanik, see Hermann Fritz Matkowski.
But I read a lot of very strange and odd writers. For instance, this one Austrian writer, Hertzmanowski, Orlando.
Muusade näitemäng vist oli. Romaan tal. Ükskõik. Et ma eelistan alati nagu veidrikke lugeda, niisuguseid kõrvalisi autoreid, ja ka minu romaanide peategelased või tegelased on pigem niisugused veidrikud.
So I really like to read odd and strange things, and also from rather odd writers, and also the protagonists in my books are rather strange.
Ja ma arvan, et on palju huvitavam lugeda, mis toimub Kabulis, kui mis toimub New Yorgis.
And for me, for instance, it's much more interesting to read what happens in Kabul than to read what happens in New York.
But what about Estonia itself? I mean, how would you describe the character, the comic character of Estonians? I mean, will Estonians mostly watch Estonian comedies, or will they watch, comedies from the US or Britain or Russian, or what are you watching?
No näiteks on selline komöödia päris populaarne ja seda näidatakse kogu aeg enam-vähem nüüd. On see Allo, ma ei tea, kas siin keegi teab.
But there is one very famous Estonian comedy.
No Estonian. It's one very famous, I think it's English made it, Allo. where they're all located in France.
Oh, hello, hello.
Oh, yeah.
Hello, hello. Yes. Yes.
This is very cool.
It's quite embarrassing, though. It's all about stereotypes.
Absolutely.
Yes, of English people making fun of French people and foreign people. We're not proud of that at all. But it is interesting for me is to what extent does a country stick to its own comic culture? You know, to what extent does Estonia create its own comedy and its own comic culture? I mean, you've always got Big Brother Russia. I'm sure there's quite a lot of, if not comedy there, tragedy, but...
No, yes, Zelensky was too a comic.
Yeah. Ukraine elected a comedian as a president. We should all elect comedians as our leaders, don't you think?
And he is very good president.
Yeah.
Absolutely, the best one. Aga ma ütleks seda, et mõnikord on huvitav, kuidas naaberrahvas näeb sinu rahvast. Näiteks nagu lätlased, eestlasi.
Yeah, so, but I think it's very interesting to how neighboring countries or neighboring nations look upon your nation. So, for instance, the Latvians, how they look upon Estonia.
On hästi palju nalju. Lätlaste arvates eestlased on hästi aeglased.
Okay, so for instance, there are a lot of jokes from Latvians that they think that Estonians are very slow.
Aga eestlastel on palju nalju selle kohta, et lätlastel on 6 varvast jalal.
Okay, but in Estonia there are a lot of jokes that Latvians have 6 toes on their foot.
It's surrealistic.
Definitely. So,
folk surrealism.
Do you have I'm asking this in all my events when I'm here. Do you have a favorite joke, an Estonian joke?
Yeah, it's very short. Woman.
Explain.
No.
Do you want?
It's one of Estonian novel writer made this joke.
We'll leave it there.
It's very short.
It's very short and very odd.
But he was just divorced.
Okay, well, that explains. You need some explanation. But Baret, this idea of a country having a very specific sense of comedy and comedy culture. I know that I've spoken about this before. The idea that in Britain we're very proud of our comedy, and do you think that comedy does emanate very specifically from specific countries?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's like anything else. It's like cuisine or styles of lifestyles or philosophical mindset, or every country has their own fingerprint, culturally, linguistically, emotionally. Some perhaps are more, I would say, advanced at certain. I mean, I think the Brits are pretty good at comedy. They're pretty good at rock music. They're pretty good at pop music. They're not so good at painting. Though there's Turner, obviously, and
Gainsborough Constable.
They're not as visually literate.
No.
Italians are more visual. They're more musical. They're less linguistically adept, and so on. So every country has their strengths and weaknesses, I think. But I think comedy is when it's good. As with anything, it transcends barriers and doesn't. I think it's universal when it has a certain kind of, it speaks to the human condition, maybe. So I don't think that. I mean, personally, I try to expose myself to everything.
Well, you live in Italy,
yeah,
and you're Armenian,
yes,
and you have the whole of Britain, also. So you must be taking your inspiration from.
I mean, I think I'm a bit of a jewel thief, and you take what you can, and you. I mean, for example, in the Fabrications, there's a lot of humor that's slapstick, and it's sort of in a way inspired by the Marx Brothers and even Seinfeld or Larry David, who's an absolute genius, I think.
Yes.
And that kind of Jewish American humor has been very important to me, and I'm very grateful to have been exposed to that kind of thing, as well as to, you know, Tolstoy and Dostoevsky or whatever. So, you know, you're always looking, I'm always taking things from different cupboards and trying on different clothes and, you know, dressing like this, and and it's always a disaster because it's an eclectic mess at the end, and it's like, well, who are you? But,
I think it's chaos. It's chaos. You both love chaos.
Yes.
And I'm going to ask you also whether you have a joke.
My favorite joke is Boris Johnson.
Okay. They're keeping it very short today. For the moment, thank you. And Veronika, do you have any questions from the live stream and from the audience?
Well, yes, I do. And I would like to say thank you to our audience online, and also encourage you here to ask questions. If you want to, you could ask in English or in German, as Rosie speaks German excellently. Okay, I've got a short question for you, and a long question to you, and 2 questions to both of you. So where should I start?
Start with Paavo, and then Baret, and then we'll do these other questions after that.
Okay, perfect. So, the question is, yesterday we've heard from Natalka Sniatanko that there is some dominance in culture, some Russian dominance in the Ukraine. So the Russian culture is dominant there. And the question is whether the situation in Estonia is similar. Dominance of culture.
Is Russian culture dominant in Estonia?
Yes.
Is that the question?
Yes, yeah. This is the question.
No, because Estonian culture is like, Estonian history is like a history of, is it interruption? Katkestused. History of interruptions. So the Russians are, in every like 40 years, there will come a new power. We have such kind of difficult geopolitical situation, and like 1.5 million only. So we have been in rules of Swedish, Russians, Polish, and so on. But always we have this. We have a very good democratic experience. We had before the Second World War. We were a republic, a very good republic, and this we are very different from Russians, really, in mentality, in other ways. But yes, we know the the Russians very well. For example, I studied like 11 years in secondary school Russian, and this was the first language. So we know the enemy very well.
May I just add?
This is the
Paavo.
Estonian joke. We know the enemy very well.
Paavo, may I just add to that? I mean, how do you in Estonia now feel about Russian literature? I mean, you've written about Gogol. You've written your characters all speak Russian. Are you reading Russian literature?
I think we don't want to cancel a culture.
Yeah.
Nowadays they are moving away everywhere from Estonia architecture, the Russian symbols.
Yeah.
But they are beautiful monuments of architecture, Stalin architecture.
Stalinist.
They just move something, some red star away.
Yeah.
Who is afraid of a red star? No Estonian. I think we know what this means.
And all the Russian books are still in the bookshops and...
No, but they don't no more bring Russian books.
They're not reading.
Because there is these sanctions.
Yeah. Veronika, your
question
to Baret.
Yeah. Now it's the second question that goes to you. It's a bit of a difficult one, but I'll do my best. It deals with the title of your novel, with the English title and the German title, and whether there is a difference in the meaning. Because the person thinks that the English title, The Fabrications, seems to indicate a certain direction and perspective more than the German title, Die Erfindung der Wirklichkeit. And the question that the person asks is concerning the structure of your book. Didn't you really want to fabricate fictions which only by reading can be understood as reality, as Wirklichkeit?
Yeah, the two titles are very different, and I think the editor of the German, Austrian publishing house Folio Verlag wanted to. Originally, there was talk of trying to render the fabrications into German, but it didn't. I think the title already existed, and so we couldn't really go with that literal translation. But actually, the German title, which in English is The Invention of Reality, is probably more illustrative of the kind of the meaning of the book, I would say, whereas the fabrications is more of a structural title that deals with the main modality, the method of the book, and fiction that becomes truth is really, I suppose, the idea behind the novel, but it's also the idea behind, as I see it, society now. And so I don't know if which title is better or more effective. I think they both have different kind of functions, but I think probably both illustrate the idea of this malleability of what how we see reality, and the reality is in a state of kind of fusion now, I would say, and it's being constantly shifted and kaleidoscopic and moving kind of in this strange way, I feel. So yeah, I mean, I'm happy with both titles, but probably The Fabrications is the more punchy, more kind of clean sounding title, yeah. But I think The Invention of Reality is also fine. So yeah.
Both good. And you have a question to both of them.
I have two short ones to both of you. First of all, it's in the field of humor general. The person says there are two wild satirists here on stage, and the question is whether you agree that satire still contains hope and distance, whereas in a violent and brutal regime, it is only bitter sarcasm that helps to describe things.
Do you mind repeating that a little bit? So basically, the core of that question is satire still?
Is satire still something that contains hope?
Does satire still contain hope? And the second part?
Whereas once you live in war, once you live in a dark regime, isn't it only sarcasm?
Can only sarcasm
helps you to live with it?
Yes.
Bitterness.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
When the Soviet Union collapsed in 90s, and nobody seems ei näinud seda ette nagu.
Nobody saw that, knew that this would come.
Yeah. Kuigi Ameerikas vist oli ju sadu sovietolooge.
Although in the United States there were hundreds of Sovietologists.
Nii et me kunagi ei tea, mingi režiim võib tunduda väga tugev ja ehitada, me kunagi ei tea, millal ta langeb nagu, on ju.
So
see võib juhtuda väga ruttu, on ju.
Yeah, so a regime might seem to be very strong, and we never know how quick it can actually go that it collapses.
Ja eriti näitab režiimi lõppu see, et lõpu ajal ehitatakse eriti suuri hooneid või midagi nagu. Midagi eriti suurt, nagu Krimmi sild.
And you can see right before the collapse of a regime that the regime builds very big buildings or structures, for instance, like the Crimean Bridge.
Et ta tahab ise uskuda veel, et ta on suur nagu.
It has to believe itself that it's big.
Aga tegelikult kukub kokku.
But then, in fact, it just collapses.
Väga ruttu.
Quickly.
So I think the idea of sarcasm or satire, sarcasm isn't part of this, is it?
Part of what?
The question was about sarcasm and whether sarcasm becomes more prominent towards in these difficult times of crisis.
I think the ironia is very dangerous tool.
Irony.
Yeah, it's very dangerous tool.
Yeah, yeah.
I prefer parody.
You prefer?
Parody.
Parody,
Yeah.
yes. Baret.
Well, I don't know if satire contains hope necessarily. I mean, I guess I'm a little suspicious of that concept of hope, because hope is often close to sentimentality, and sentimentality is often close to imprecision, and imprecision is often close to cliche, and so on. So, you know, I personally, when I'm satirical or try to be, I don't necessarily see hope as being a component of that. I think satire should critique that which is being satirized. So that's an important function of literature. Whether that leads to hope or not, I wouldn't know. I'm not trying to give hope to anyone. I'm trying to just, as I said, give intellectual purity, which sounds terribly arrogant, but what I mean is I'm trying to show the limitations of a society with a view to trying to make it better, which may well be misguided, but that's just the way I am. Regarding sarcasm, I think anything whatever works, sort of thing. If you use sarcasm to come to terms with trauma or loss or terrible suffering, that's fine. I would never say don't do it. Use sarcasm, use humor, use whatever. The important thing, though, as I say, is always try to keep some semblance of intellectual precision, truth, so that facts remain facts and are not rewritten, revised, distorted, negated, obliterated by propaganda, by lies, by the easy solutions of a mentality-driven press, and so on. And that's what writers should always do. They're custodians of some kind of honoring of the truth, and that's sacrosanct. And particularly today, I think, when the truth is in danger of being kind of almost not even disregarded, but sort of reduced to something as irrelevant, and that's, I think, where we are, and I think that's very dangerous, and we have to always honor the truth and not be compromised and not be swayed by these easy quick fix political rhetorical.
In that alone, there is hope, though.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
And sarcasm is cruelty, isn't it? It's basically it's where humor has reached a very base level of cruelty, which is, of course, not what you do, but you can see it happening around you, I think. Are there any other questions?
Well, just a brief last one. The person says that writers for sure are not prophets, but still, if you're not afraid that what you write and create as reality in literature might become real reality one day.
So the basis of that question again is if you didn't write?
If they are afraid that what they write might be real life one day, might come true.
Do you fear that what you write, well, it has come true in your case.
Yeah.
Do you fear that what you write might come true?
See on läinud täide.
And it's happened in both novels, I would think.
Ühes Kongo tango raamatus, kus on rongad saavad mul seal raamatus lapse ja mõne aasta pärast tuligi selline uudis, et Taueri rongad olid lapse saanud.
So in another novel that I wrote, which is called Congo Tango, there's a story about the Raven Towers in London. And in this novel, Congo Tango, I wrote that two of the ravens, they get a child. a baby raven, and actually this really happened some years after I wrote this in the novel.
And the same ravens.
And it was the same ravens as in the novel.
Be careful what you write. I know. What about you, Baret?
I don't really think about it that much. As I say, I just tried to write something that's strong as a
and reflects
story.
reality.
Yeah,
you know, as well as recreating reality, you're reflecting it very.
Well,
very
I'm trying to. I don't know how far I succeed, but I mean, obviously, if something then there's some prophetic element that's interesting and that can happen, but I don't consciously feel very strongly about that. I let the writing take me to wherever it wants to go.
A purist. If there
I wouldn't say that.
Are there any questions from the audience? And if not, then I'm just going to, with one fantastic, great.
Baret, I would like to ask you, one critic labeled your novel a modern Frankenstein tale. So how does creativity and the creative aspect, how did you process that in the novel? Well, because it's not just the creation of a person, but also of an identity. So creativity, I think, is a big issue in your novel.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, we're all. I mean, the main aspect of creativity, I suppose, is this relationship between Daniel and Oscar, the writer and the projectionist. And there's this, as I said at the beginning, there's almost a symbiotic kind of relationship between the two, whereby Daniel writes Oscar's life, and it becomes manifested. And that's I think that the idea I was excited by there was this notion of how our own individual destinies can be, in a sense, mapped out by encounters with others, or relationships with others, or contact with another person. So there was this very specific dual relationship that is at the heart of the book, and that's an idea that has some similarity with Frankenstein and myths like, the Golem and Oscar Wilde's Portrait of Dorian Gray and Pygmalion, and this notion of someone becoming something else because of the will of someone else. And that's really just an idea that I find fascinating, and it's really central in literature, I suppose. And I think we are all touched by other people. We are all, the product of our experiences and our encounters and our knowledge of others and the time we spend with others. So we all, I would say, life's like this wind that blows through our lives, and all the debris and all the beauty and all the paraphernalia and experiences sticks, kind of is as it were, attached to our beings, and we become these, in a sense, these works of art also that have had encounters with beautiful souls or experiences or places or whatever it is. So we're all, in a sense, also what the book's talking about is that we're all everyone else. We're all, when I say I also mean you. So I am you and you are me, which is kind of a Buddhist metaphysical spiritual thing, but it's also my take on how we all kind of become other people through our encounters with them. And I think that's just human, that's a human thing. It's not sinister or negative. It's just we all acquire, we all learn from others, and we all are, in a sense, custodians of everyone else's souls and testaments. And that's, I think, quite beautiful.
Indeed. Any more questions? And if not, I would personally like to thank you both for changing us as well, and for a very beautiful session, because I think these discussions are also about change and hope and la condition humaine, if you like, the human condition. And if I may paraphrase you and say, I would like to thank Paavo Matsin and Baret Magarian, and of course Max Moorman as well, to say thank you for these satirical works of art. Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you.
Ja, herzlichen Dank. Mir bleibt noch Ihnen eine gute Mittagspause zu wünschen. Um 14:30 Uhr setzen wir fort mit einem deutschsprachigen Pendel, Dana von Suffren und Konrad Boguslav Bach. Eine schöne Mittagspause.
Thank you.